Well, thank you, everybody. I'm Dixie Summers. I'm a treasurer, and I'm the slideshow keeper tonight. So first, just want to welcome you all to the VSO annual meeting for 2023. And before I turn things over to Bill, I want to just do a little bit of, I guess, Zoom detail. We're going to use Zoom at this meeting, including voting. So I'll talk about that when we get to that point. The meeting is being recorded. And a couple things. We have you all muted as you come in, but if you would keep your microphone and video off during most of the meeting, that would be great. But if you need to ask a question, and we certainly want to hear from you, you can put your question in the chat using the chat at the bottom of the screen, or you can, when we get to the Q&A after Bryan Watts' presentation, you can also raise your hand. You click on the participants, and then a little thing will come up, an icon to raise your hand. So with that, let me turn it over to Bill.
Okay. Thanks, Patty. Thanks, Dixie, excuse me. So like Dixie, I want to welcome everybody. This is the Virginia Society of Ornithology's 94th year, and you're helping us celebrate on Cinco de Mayo. I can't tell you how much of a pleasure it's been to work with the VSO board and all of the officers. And we've got people on our board that are some of the state's leading biologists. We have award-winning officers, award-winning authors. We have people who have operated, who have been involved at the highest level of the state government on our board, and some of the state's leading field biologists, as well as conservation biologists. Particularly, I want to thank Diane Lepkowski, our vice president, Dixie Summers, who is the treasurer, whom we'll have many interactions with here in just a few minutes. Phil Kenny keeps us all informed with his great work as secretary, and everybody who does anything with membership recognizes the amount of work that Shirley DeVan puts into what she does for the organization. I want to take a minute too to recognize the board of directors. Our outgoing class of 2023, I want to particularly recognize Patty Rhyme, Alan Williams, Ellison Orcutt, and Faye Crawford Cooper. They're not going to go anywhere. They're just taking time off from the board, and I know that all four of them are going to stay involved in what we're doing. Our class of 2024 members for the board of directors: Bill Leidy, Guy Babineau, Chris Bolgiano, and Lisa Corner Perry. And then class of 2025, Jessica Ruthenberg, Jason Bullock, and Todd Day. And each of those has all of them have very specific roles that they've been fulfilling for the organization. I need to acknowledge too the work done by John Stiersky for the Raven, and Matt Anthony and his team of regional editors for our outstanding Virginia Birds Journal. Matt has done an exceptional amount of work bringing the journal up to date, and so have his regional editors. Dixie, another jack of all trades, is our newsletter editor, and you can see the excellence in her work quarterly. Lisa Perry manages our website and is always so willing to help us get it updated when we make a request for her to do that. Shirley has been working on archiving old VSO newsletters. This has turned into kind of a labor of love for her, as we've managed to get many of the back issues of the newsletter dating back to the 1950s. She's made requests for everybody. If you think you might have some of those, let Shirley know. We're going to be scanning those, and we'll eventually have them archived to the website. We have a very active annotated checklist revision team. That is a revision of the goal book. Matt Anthony, Todd Day, John Spar, Bob Ake, myself, and Ellison Orcutt, who is the liaison to the board for that. Matt Anthony, Chris Monahan, Paul Glass, Larry Cartwright, Todd Day, Nick Newberry, Baxter Beamer, Ellison Orcutt, and Andrew Rapp are the folks who run VARCOM for us. And it's one of those parts of the organization that operates somewhat behind the scenes, but is an integral part of the ornithology for the state of Virginia. Recently, there was a dinner held to celebrate the career of Becky Gwynn. And Becky has been a longtime advocate for VSO, and we much appreciate everything that she does. But that dinner was attended by Bill Leidy and Dixie at a table that was hosted, that Bill Leidy helped us get seats at by the American Bird Conservancy, which is just wonderful. Also want to mention that recently the Rockingham Bird Club produced its second edition of the Birds of Rockingham County. Robin Puffenberger, Dave Wendelken, and Claire Mellinger were very much a part of that. And if you look in there, you'll see some of Diane Lipkowski's great photographs. We were recently in the Richmond Magazine talking about outreach for birding in the state. And VSO is very heavily involved in the revision of the state wildlife, DWR's wildlife action plan. That's going to be a 3 or 4 year process, and we are part of that. If you remember last year, I know Guy will because he and his wife Susan were the winners. We had the Royal Raffle for people to go out on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. And we want to extend a sincere thanks to the Department of Wildlife Resources for making that happen. One of the folks that's logged in here tonight, I just met him for the first time face to face, if you will. Our efforts to reach out to the younger birder crowd is one of the folks who stepped forward to do some work in Loudoun County is Patrick Lewis, who is pioneering some nice field work at Algonquian Park. He's got a community set of citizens that's looking strong at that. So this is a model of something that VSO hopes to do at other parks and refuges throughout the state. Patty, Rhyme, and Barb Schlachter in the Richmond area, Patty over in Highland County with John Spar and Dan Beaker, have an incredible American Kestrel project that's been in operation now for a number of years. And Patty just sent us all a great report on that, which I hope you'll get a chance to see soon. And last but certainly not least is our evolving, trying to learn the ins and outs of being a property holder with our Bramble Hill property, which straddles the Virginia-West Virginia line. Jason Bullock and his committee have done exceptional work for that. And thanks too for the Coastal Virginia Wildlife Observatory, which donated a solar panel so that Bramble Hill could have a motor station set up. So I think we will go on. Dixie, I'll turn things over to you at this point. And Dixie's going to give us a treasurer's report and an Atlas fundraising committee report.
Great, thank you. I have a couple of slides about the treasurer's report, and I know there's a lot of numbers here. I just want to let you know this will be published in the newsletter, the summer newsletter, so you'll get a chance to maybe study it a bit more closely. What this shows is the balances in our various funds at the beginning and end of 2022. We have 4 major funds: General, Endowment, Conservation, and the Atlas, the VABBA2 fund. Within the Conservation Fund, there's a General Fund, there's the Kestrel Fund, which supports the work that Bill mentioned that Patty and John do down in Highland County. And then the Bramble Hill Fund, which is for the property there in Highland County. We've been working hard on raising money, especially to beef up the Bramble Hill Fund so we have a healthy balance to make sure we can deal with any costs related to maintaining the property as well as habitat maintenance. And then obviously the Atlas Fund, you've been hearing a lot about that at every possible chance we get to tell you about it. And I'll talk a little bit about that more in a moment. But we ended the year, I think, successful in terms of raising money. We have over $300,000 in assets at the moment, and as of the end of December. And our general fund is also healthy. So I think we had a successful year, thanks to all of you who support the VSO. Just a little bit about the ins and outs here. General fund, most of that comes from your membership dues. So I've broken that out here just so you can see how important that is. So we received $25,000 and just in memberships, and then another $4,000 in other general fund. So looking down, you can see what we received in each fund, how much we spent, and the result of that is reflected in the previous slide. If you have any questions about this, you can put something in the chat. So I know this is a lot of details being thrown at you all at once. Let me talk about the Atlas Fund. As of today, we have $155,400 in that fund, and that includes almost $105,000 in cash and a little over $50,000 in pledges. The pledges are all for the Sponsor a Species program, and we'll be running that until either we get the Atlas published or we run out of species to be sponsored. We have 195 breeding species in the state, and so far 98 of them, over half, are sponsored. So if you want to sponsor species, there's still quite a few left, and that'd be wonderful. The 155,000 is about 53% of the goal, which is the amount that we're going to need to pay for the publication of the Atlas. I'm sure you know that this has been a long project with 5 years worth of field work, 2 years or 2.5 years of cleaning up the 5 million record data set and doing the analysis work. That analysis work is almost finished, and we are entering a contract with the Conservation Management Institute at Virginia Tech, who will undertake the creation of the content for the Atlas. And later we'll have a separate contract with a web developer to actually develop the website. And then CMI will be responsible for taking the content, getting it into that website for publication around the end of 2025. So I think we've done really well. I want to thank everyone who's donated, sponsored a species, participated in the Royal Raffle, and we'll be continuing to ask for support and also working on major donors and grants, as well as individual donations. Okay, let me turn this over to Meredith Bell, who will talk about field trips.
Thanks, Dixie. It's really exciting to see so many familiar faces here, regulars who attend our field trips. And I wanted to just share some of the upcoming events that we have going on. The first weekend of June, we'll be coming here to my home county of Gloucester County, because we want to showcase for you Machicomico State Park. If you haven't been, it's just a wonderful park, so well maintained. They just keep up with the habitats beautifully. And we have field trips planned on Friday afternoon and Sunday morning to other local parks. And another favorite field trip every year is to Chincoteague, and we've got those dates set. We'll be having an announcement come out in the newsletter. That and the Outer Banks trip in February, we've had 100 or more people coming to those. They're just very popular. And Gloucester County, we have almost 70 right now. So there's still an opportunity for you to sign up if you'd like to attend. The field trip registration, you can see over on the right side if you go to virginiabirds.org. And then we're going to be starting something new here in June called regional field trips. And this is where we're going to, it's still in the works, it's in process, but we're going to be setting up half-day local field trips so that you can participate if you're not able to make our weekend field trips. And we're very pleased that our member Clark Olson has volunteered to head that up. So you'll be hearing more from us as we get those in place. So thanks for the opportunity to share. We're such a great, friendly group. If you haven't ever been on one of the weekend trips, whether you're an experienced birder or brand new, it's just a wonderful chance to meet other people and learn a lot about the birds because everyone is willing to be so helpful. So thanks for the opportunity to share.
Patty, it's time.
Oh, go ahead, Bill. Sorry.
No, I was just going to introduce Patty.
Oh.
Patty Ryan will
Okay.
take care of our elections, please.
All right. We're going to have an election for the VSO officers for this year. President Diane Lepkowski from Harrisonburg. Vice President Bill Williams from Williamsburg. Treasurer Dixie Summers, Alexandria. Secretary Bill Kenny from Vienna, and Membership Secretary Shirley DeVan from Williamsburg. I guess we do our vote.
Yeah, so here's how we're going to do this. What we're going to do is I will open a poll, and everybody as a participant is going to see a screen come up that's going to have the question, shall the proposed candidates for VSO officers be elected? And you can vote clicking on yes or no, and then click on submit. So let me see if this will work.
Cool.
And we'll leave this open for a minute or two. I don't know, how many people do we have online?
We have 55 online, and I'm trying to find out where I click the button.
And we're board members, I mean VSO members voting, correct?
Yes, right. And those of us who are co-hosts, you won't see the
That's why I'm not seeing the button. Okay.
yeah. Sorry about that. Okay.
100% have voted.
Okay. So the results are, I don't know if you can see that. All votes were yes. Thank you. Okay, let me close that. And then we'll go on to the class of 2026.
Okay, we have 3 new board members that we will vote on. Monica, please help me. Is it Hoyle from Emory, Nick Newberry from Oakton, and Dan Albrecht Mallinger from Richmond. So I believe we vote before they speak. Is that correct?
I'll let them speak.
Okay. How about you, Monica? You want to start?
Sure. My name is Monica Hoyle. I live in the part of the state that we refer to as the Great Southwest. I'm the alumni director at Emory and Henry College and live here in the community of Emory. I am by far the least qualified for this bunch, but I'm enthusiastic. And I've been talking to Bill a little bit about how I might be able to at least be part of the conversation about fundraising and social media. And I'm certainly eager to learn more about the organization and see where I can help.
Thank you. Nick Newberry.
Hello, I'm Nick Newberry. I live in Oakton, which is in Northern Virginia. I'm a longtime Virginia resident, Virginia birder. I cut my teeth here in Virginia on birding about 20 years ago when I was in 2nd grade. Haven't looked back ever since. I've been involved in various VSO projects. I've written for Virginia Birds for almost a decade. actually over a decade at this point. And I'm currently a high school teacher, so I teach students about birds and birding. So I'm very interested in sort of the next generation of birders. And yeah, I spent a long time in Williamsburg, so I met a bunch of the Williamsburg crowd and have gone birding with them. But yeah, I'm eager to participate on the board and to support VSO as it attempts to meet the challenges of our current time and see what we can do with the membership and work on some really exciting projects.
Okay, thanks, Nick. How about you, Dan?
Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Albrecht-Mallinger. I'm based in Richmond City proper. I'm an instructor at Virginia Commonwealth University in the Environmental Studies program with a focus on conservation practice and natural history. I've lived in Virginia off and on for 10 years now, but I've been a full-time resident now for 5. And I got my master's actually under the tutelage of Patty Rhyme up in Highland County, and I'm a long-term collaborator with Dr. Leslie Bullock. I'm really excited to be involved with hopefully more than one aspect of VSO, but I'm especially excited about science communication, conservation projects, as well as pitching in any way that we can help get students more involved with birding at any stage of their academic career. K through 12, undergraduate, and potentially with graduate scholarships and that stuff. Super excited about all of that. And any excuse to visit Highland County and help out Bramble Hill, I would just be delighted. So,
Thank you, Dan. It's good to see you. Okay. Okay.
We have another poll. The question, shall the proposed candidates for the class of 2026 Board of Directors be elected? And let me bring up the poll. Okay. Looks like we're at the end here.
And while we're waiting for the tabulation, I want to thank Patty and Todd Day for serving on the nominations committee.
Thank you.
This is the future of the VSO. This is why it's so incredibly important for these kinds of things. And thanks to Monica, Nick, and Dan for coming on board.
So they are unanimously elected. Thank you.
Excellent.
And this is the first time we've done this polling thing, and it actually works. It's amazing. So, okay, let me go to the next.
And Patty.
Okay, back to me. The James Ike Service Award. This is given for the outstanding service to the VSO. This year's recipient is Jennifer Gaden, and I'm going to turn it over to Guy Babineau to read a little bit about Jenny's service.
Thanks, Patty. I'm really happy to be able to offer some words of support of Jenny's well-deserved award. So she's an active volunteer. You know, she's been the past president of the Piedmont, Virginia Bird Club, then the Monticello Bird Club, as well as on the board of the VSO and secretary for the VSO. But she keeps on volunteering. You know, she's been the compiler for the Charlottesville Christmas bird count since 2006. And one of the things that she makes that special is she includes everybody and figures out ways to get everybody involved. You know, she also continues to do things like teach for lifelong learning. She supports young birder initiatives in the area. She teaches the Ravenna chapter of the Master Naturalists in their birding classes. She's also volunteered for things like Keep Cats Indoors and helping reduce the number of bird strikes in windows. She's also the author and one of the authors and editors of our local annotated checklist for the area. And, you know, she just continues to volunteer in so many different ways, and that's just a short list. And those contributions, along with those others, are what makes Jenny very worthy of this award. So please join me in congratulating Jenny.
And I think I saw Jenny in the audience, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
Great.
Okay.
I have a question, Bill. Should we do the grants next or the Byrd Award?
The Byrd Award, please.
Okay. The Mitchell Byrd Award is one of the highest awards we give out. It recognizes outstanding scientific achievement in the field of ornithology. Now, this is probably the most you'll hear me talk, so I'll try to be not too emotional here. This year's recipient is Charles Ziegenfuss, Zig. His work in ornithology and bird conservation has spanned more than 50 years and has run the gamut, says Dan Crystal, professor at William & Mary. Dan nominated Zig for this award. He praised him as a mentor and a major contributor to the seminal research on reproductive biology and evolution of the dark-eyed junco. That was done at Mountain Lake Biological Station, and I was lucky enough to be there that summer, years ago, and met Zig way back then. Supporting this nomination were Elizabeth Isle, a VSO member and Rockingham Bird Club member, Diane Lepkowski, a longtime friend, Rockingham Bird Club vice president, and now vice president of the VSO, soon to be president of the VSO, and also Claire Mellinger, professor emeritus of Eastern Mennonite University, and Bander of Salwood Owls at the Highland Retreat Camp. Zig taught a very popular ornithology class at JMU. He was the founding member of the Rockingham Bird Club. He was a true educator. He promoted bird conservation, helping anyone who was interested in doing the same. He installed and maintained countless nest boxes benefiting bluebirds, tree swallows, and American kestrels. He came out here a few years back and we winter trapped a bunch of kestrels, me and John Spar and Zig. We had a great time. He also volunteered at many banding stations, Dolly Sods in West Virginia, and of course the Highland Retreat Camp for Sowets. He operated a banding station on the Rockingham County Farm and banded wintering sparrows on other private properties. And he was always on hand for local bird counts, including the Christmas bird count in Rockingham and several breeding bird survey routes. His encouragement, effort, and generosity in sharing his knowledge and enthusiasm has been a gift beyond words to the birders in the valley, Shenandoah Valley, and all across Virginia. He inspired many of his students to pursue ornithological or conservation-minded careers, or to embrace birding just as an avocation. A longtime life member of the VSO, he often took students on the Outer Banks field trip in February. And as Dan Crystal wrote, after detailing all of the personal recollections and many achievements, and the amazing thing was, he was a math professor and he was an electrician first. And all of these contributions he did just because. Sadly, Zig died shortly after, but we rushed and got the award done, and Diane went into the nursing home where he was, and his family was there. So he was able to see the award, which made a huge difference to us who loved him dearly. Thank you.
Thanks, Patty. That was beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Zig was very special.
He didn't
to all
mind
of us.
getting, he didn't mind getting bitten or taloned by, it was just amazing. His hands were always bleeding.
Patty,
Yeah.
Jenny Gaden is on the line.
Okay.
On the Zoom, if you want to see if she wants to say a word or two.
Sure. Go ahead, Jenny. Well,
Are you hearing me?
yes.
Oh, okay. 'Cause I've got some stuff in the way here. Hold on. Now, okay. I should be unmuted, right? Okay.
You are.
When I first heard that I was getting this award, I thought there must be some mistake. What the heck have I done? But I must say it's very nice of you to enumerate all these things, and it is a great honor, really, to get this award. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you.
Okay, Patty. Conservation awards.
I'm still not done. All right, we gave out 4 conservation grants this year. I think we had to go over our budget a little bit, which is what I wanted to do. Barbara Slatcher from CCB. We purchased 10 kestrel boxes to be placed at the Shirley Plantation, Fort Lee, and the town of Surrey and Powhatan. Is that how you say it? Powhatan County. The Rockfish Wildlife Sanctuary requested mealworms for their injured birds, and we gave them $200 to do that. The Clifton Institute, we purchased 5 camera units that are installed in their kestrel boxes. And the White House Farm Foundation in Prince William County, we gave them money to build a purple martin box at Leopold's Preserve at Haymarket, Virginia.
And I will say that the purple martin box is there. I saw it a couple weeks ago. And last word is there aren't any martins in it yet, but they're flying around it.
Okay.
Excellent. So I want to take a couple of minutes here to recognize the Virginia Breeding Bird Atlas 2 regional coordinators. For those of you who were involved in the Atlas, I think most everybody was, you appreciate how much work it took for these regional coordinators to manage to get the blocks, priority blocks done so that the Atlas data bank is so successful and so well populated. So Bob Ake, Louis Barnett. Louis, unfortunately, has passed away. We'll make sure that his recognition is extended to his wife. Dave Carr, Bob Epperson, Paul Glass, Kurt Gaskell, Steve Hopp, Michael Lott, Ellison Orcutt, Lisa Corner-Perry, Zach Polton, John Spar, David and Evan Spears, Mike Stinson, Jerry Vai, and Dave Euchre. These people all deserve a very strong amount of credit for everything that they did over that 5-year period before and after the Atlas. That's a copy of the certificate that they're going to be given. This was designed by one of Ashley Peel's students at Virginia Tech. And their name will be where it says coordinator name, obviously. They'll be signed and mailed to them soon. So thanks to all of them for that.
Going back to the conservation grants, there's a question in the chat. Do we know where in Powhatan County the boxes are being placed?
I believe you'd have to contact Barbara Slatcher about that. I don't know the specific location.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight. In February of this year, Bryan and his wife Marion hosted a celebration of Mitchell Byrd's extraordinary career as an educator, mentor, and one of Virginia's leading conservation biologists and thinkers. In attendance that day were many of Mitchell's students. They came from all over the country to be there to celebrate with Mitchell. Some of these folks were leading biologists, leading state conservation efforts, national conservation efforts, and several of them are recognized at the international level for the field work that they did after they matriculated from the College of William and Mary. One of those, of course, is Bryan. And it's a real privilege to have Bryan be our speaker for tonight. It's hard to encapsulate all of the field work that Bryan has done over his career at William and Mary, but from tagging whimbrels up in the Arctic to working on the crowned eagle in Argentina to working on shorebirds in Panama and thigh-deep mud, Bryan seems to be everywhere where there's a need to understand conservation biology for birds. And truly, what he and his colleagues have done internationally it's hard to quantify all of that. Bryan is the Mitchell Byrd Professor of Conservation Biology and the Director of the Center for Conservation Biology at William & Mary. He's authored more than 600 publications on avian ecology and conservation, and he studied birds since his early childhood in West Virginia, where he was mentored. This is important here for all of us, mentored by members of local bird club. He received his undergraduate degree from Virginia Tech, his master's degree from the College of William & Mary, and his doctorate from the University of Georgia. In 2015, the Center for Conservation Biology's annual report had this brief essay by Bryan. The air in early May is full of song in the southern Appalachians. In the valley where I grew up, Donnelly Hollow, that's in West Virginia, was a magical place where you could easily hear 20 species of warblers in a morning. When I was still in elementary school, Polly Bolo would take me up the wooded trail, whisper a bird name, and squeeze my hand every time it sang until I was able to squeeze first. Together, hand in hand, we would walk up Donnelly Hollow through a long list of species. Years later, when I could return to lead her up the trail by hand, then in her 80s and hard of hearing, I would describe the birds singing around us. She would smile, close her eyes, and imagine the chorus. Such is the exchange between generations of people who share a common passion. Bryan Watts. Thank you, Bryan.
Let's see, Dixie. Are we ready?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Bill. It's and thanks for having me. It's a thrill to be with you all. And as Bill said, I grew up in the Brooks Bird Club. Wonderful bird people. They were passionate and knowledgeable about birds. More than that, they were always willing to share what they knew. The VSO is just like that. And my hope is that younger people in Virginia will take advantage of the members of the VSO, as I was lucky enough to do when I was young. Let's see if I can get this going. Is that good, Dixie?
Yes.
Okay. Bill said the consensus was that we wanted to hear about eagles, and so that's where this came from. I'm thrilled to do that. And so let's see. There are a couple things that I'll try to cover. One is I'd like to say something about the Chesapeake Bay, the structure of the bay. That's the stage on which this population performs. I'd like to say a little bit about bald eagles, how they fit in, their breeding, etc. And then I'd like to say something about the population history and recovery that we've seen here in the Virginia part of the bay. And then something about where are we now? What's going on now with the population? So let's start there. The Chesapeake Bay is one of the world's great estuaries. It is unusual compared to other estuaries that we see throughout the world in that it has the highest drainage basin to water volume ratio. And the consequence of that is that the bay waters are relatively shallow, and that becomes important for the productivity. The shoreline is tremendous, estimated 19,000 kilometers. And if you look at this image, what you can see is this crease here that actually tracks, I-95 tracks along that crease. That crease is the landward extent of tidal influence. It's the boundary of the estuary. That's where the rocks of the Piedmont meet the unconsolidated sands and soils of the coastal plain. And so that's what we consider to be the boundary of the estuary. That's the area that I'll talk about. One of the other things that we see that I think you know is that the Chesapeake Bay is one of the most productive aquatic ecosystems in the world. And the reason for that is the shallow nature. We have over 600,000 acres of water where we have light penetration all the way to the bottom. And so it's like an underwater garden. We also have increasing nearshore fertilization of that. And we also have a warm climate. And so this particular image shows a chlorophyll reflectance composite. And what you can see is the Chesapeake Bay lights up with chlorophyll. Tremendously productive aquatic ecosystem. And that really relates to the main bird consumers that we have: osprey, great blue heron, eagles, now pelicans, cormorants. All of those depend on this high productivity. Something about the water inputs. We have two types of water inputs into the bay. We have oceanic waters at the mouth near Norfolk, and then we have freshwater inputs at the fall line. There are four major rivers that account for 80% of the freshwater inputs: the Susquehanna, the Potomac, the Rappahannock, and the James. In between these two inputs, we have a gradient of salinity with tidal fresh being close to the fall line and high saline waters near the mouth. The segmentation of salinity really has a lot to do with the distribution of plants and fish within the estuary. And you'll see in a moment, they also have something to do with the distribution of eagles and other consumers of fish. And as I think you know, humans are an increasing part of the Bay watershed. Bowash is the second largest mega city in the world, second only to Tokyo, stretching from Boston down to DC. But as you know, extending now from DC down the I-95 corridor to Richmond, and then from Richmond down the I-64 corridor to Virginia Beach. This area accounts for $2.5 trillion worth of economic activity, or about 15% of our GDP. Because of that, there's high human density, there's congestion, as you know, and there's ongoing rapid development. And I want to show you what it looks like when that money sort of flows out throughout the landscape. What this shows is human density at the block level. This is the human census data at the block level beginning in 1949. And I'll show you a chronosequence here up to present and what that sprawl is looking like. 69, 89, 2000, and 2020. So humans like the Bay, and we are moving into the Bay and continue to do that, and we are an increasing influence on the habitats and the structure throughout the Bay watershed. Right? One of the reasons that we like the Bay is because of its bounty, its productivity: crabs, oysters, clams, fish. And one of the messages that I'd like to leave with everybody is that we need to leave some of that bounty for other consumers. We have major other consumers that depend on the Bay, eagles being one of those, not the only one. And we really, as we look forward, need to begin to plan for these species also. Not just our needs, not just the commercial needs, but the needs of the other species that we consider to be part of the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem. They need to be considered up front. And we need to be insisting on that as people concerned about our bird populations. Okay, I'd like to move on now to sort of a general introduction to bald eagles. As you may know, bald eagles are one of about a dozen species of what we refer to as sea eagles. Some of the common species that I'm sure you're familiar with are like the African fish eagle, stellar sea eagle. Those are species that we hear quite a bit. There are other species that are less well known: Pallas fish eagle, Sanford eagle in the Solomon Island. So there are a number of these species globally. They are very similar in their morphology, in their development, and in their ecology. And in fact, when we had population declines of bald eagles here, these other species mirrored that. When we began to have recoveries of bald eagles, other species mirrored that recovery. And so very similar. These are like cousins in the way that they look and they behave. Our bald eagle is the only representative in the New World. All the other species of sea eagles are Old World, and our bald eagle is restricted to North America. So there is no representative of this large genus in South America. They are restricted here. Everybody always asks about breeding. I thought I would say some things about breeding and chick development. Our particular eagles in this particular latitude in the Chesapeake Bay are resident year-round. Other populations, like in the southeast and the northeast, are migratory. Ours are not migratory. They are resident year-round. They begin to work on nests typically in October. That work intensifies up to laying in January, February. And the nest structure for bald eagles is large. It typically starts with a platform of large sticks, maybe 2 inches in diameter or so, that birds bring and begin to build a platform. When you start to see eagles carrying grass, either marsh grass or terrestrial grass, that's the lining material, and the nest is nearly complete, or the maintenance is nearly complete. What you can see looking down on this nest is a clutch of 3 eggs. Our population typically has 1 to 3 eggs, occasionally more than that, actually rarely 1. It's typically 2 or 3 eggs that eagles have. One of the things that you'll notice about the surface of this nest is that there is an egg cup there. These eggs are sitting in an egg cup. That is an elevation of the lining material into a cup that holds the eggs, and we'll see in just a minute that it has another function as well. So these nests are large. They're typically very well crafted, and the finishing of the nest is the lining with soft vegetation material. People always ask about how large are eagle eggs. Eagle eggs are about as long as a baseball is in diameter. They're about the size of a swan egg, larger than a goose egg, about swan size. Now you can see a bird in incubation posture. This is what we call a flatback bird. That indicates that the bird is incubating. But notice where the bird is situated. If you've ever seen an eagle come into a nest for an incubation exchange, what you'll see is that they'll crouch down. They do have a brood patch. They'll put that on the eggs, but they'll rock back and forth. That rocking back and forth is fitting that egg cup. And so what they're able to do is to trap a dead air layer and superheat that dead air layer. They can do this with eggs. They can also later do it with young chicks. And that is to seal off that. There's no draft in there. There's no leakage. So they're able to seal that egg cup. And that's one of the purposes of the egg cup there. Oh, let's see. Oops. Incubation in eagles is about 36 days or so. And after that period, the eggs will begin to hatch, and you'll see very quickly that they look like this. This is a bird with natal down. The natal down is white. It's very wispy. It doesn't have much insulating properties. You can see this bird is still sitting in the egg cup. That egg cup will last until the chicks are about 2 to 3 weeks old. Once they move out of that, they'll flatten that, and the surface loses the egg cup, and it's just a flat platform. These are what we refer to as blondies. They are very distinctive from the air. You can tell a bird of this age easily from the air. These birds are up to 10 days old. At 10 days, the natal down, this white wispy down, begins to be replaced by a much more insulated down, and they will keep that until they have their contour feathers. Here you can see that insulating down. These birds are 2 weeks old. And that down is much different than the natal down. It's very thick and insulating. One of the things that you can see in this particular image is the large feet. Like all raptors, what happens is that the feet reach maximum size fairly early in development, and the chicks sort of grow into the feet. The other thing that you'll notice here is that the birds are sitting back on their joints. They don't have a lot of coordination of their feet and legs at this point. That will come later. So watch as we go through this sequence here that they are sitting back on their joints, and eventually they will raise up and become vertical. At this point in development, these chicks are developing very rapidly, and so they're always tired because of the growth rate, and so they sleep most of the time. You can go up in the nest and they'll just fall asleep. They're extremely tired from the growth rate. This chick is about 4.5 weeks old, and you can see that the contour feathers are developing in. This is very readily observable from the air. The last track to fill in is the ventral track along the belly. Notice the bird is still sitting back on the joints. Another characteristic of the nest is this outer fencing. They will put an outer fence around the nest, and that tends to hold the younger chicks in that are mobile. These chicks are about 6 weeks old, and you can see that the ventral track is still not feathered in. They are still sitting back on their joints. Between 6 weeks and 8 weeks, they become much more vertical. They're much more alert. Eagles reach their terminal mass at about 5 weeks of age. They don't fledge until 12 weeks of age, and so that half of development is really for neuromuscular development. So they learn their coordination in the second half. They're already at maximum weight, but that later half of development is strictly neuromuscular and some feather elongation. These birds here have fledged, and I'm going to show you some different age plumages. But one of the things that I want to point out is that it's not just plumages that change in eagles. It's actually a motif. It's not just the plumage, it's the iris, it's the bill color, it's the soft tissue. These are what we refer to as chocolate birds. These are hatchier birds. When you see them in the first 3 to 4 weeks, they're very characteristic. They're uniform dark brown. This is the only time during their development and throughout their life where you'll have just one generation of feathers. After this point, once they initiate their first partial molt, throughout their life, they will have different generations of feathers, and those can be visible. This is a second-year bird, and this is a transitional plumage. This bird has not initiated molt. What's happened is that their feathers begin to fade with sun exposure. Once we get to this time of year, late spring, early summer, you'll begin to see a lot of replacement. Second-year birds are the most ratty looking of all the plumages. Once you get into late summer, these second-year birds are missing a lot of feathers. They have multiple generations of feathers, and they're not very attractive. Note that the bird still has dark irises and a dark bill at this point. This is a third-year bird, and now you can begin to see the characteristic hood developing. You can see the bill beginning to change more towards a yellow, and you can see that the iris is now a dirty yellow. In my way of looking after handling hundreds of eagles, this to me is just the most striking plumage. This plumage is the most reminiscent of white-tailed sea eagle of the UK and Northern Europe. Their hood is really a bronze, and there's something the way the hood goes along with the iris and the bill that is really striking. This particular individual is a white-bellied third year, and the white belly is an alternate plumage. It represents maybe 20% of the birds in third year that you see. They're white bellies. The others don't have the white belly plumage. This is a fourth-year bird. You can see the bill is still retaining some dark. The hood is still retaining some dark, and the tail also some dark. But with each successive molt, they're coming closer to the definitive plumage. And here you can see a bird in full definitive plumage. This is a large female. And this bird has multiple contour generations, and you can see that when you look at it. It's modeled when you're up close. Also in the wing, you'll see that differences in feather generations. At a distance, it's not as noticeable. And here you can see the striking definitive plumage. The white is almost a powdery white. The bill is a beautiful yellow, and it matches with the soft tissue around the eye, and the iris is now full yellow iris. Very striking in this plumage, but in my view, just as striking in the previous plumages and motifs that the bird goes through. One of the things that I'll mention is, as you know, this particular species has delayed maturation. They typically don't breed for the first time until they're 5 years old. So they have a steep learning curve to get to this point. What you may not realize is that that learning curve continues, and you can see that here in these graphs. Okay, so that's the first year of breeding and all the way out to 15 years old. So there's an increase in success rate and also brood size in that period, and that learning is still continuing to go. So experience matters for this particular species. The older adults are much more experienced and capable of pulling off broods. I wanted to say something about the genders. Male and females differ in size, with the female being about 30% larger. Our birds here in the Chesapeake Bay, the females tend to be about 10 to 12 pounds. The males are more like 7 to 8. So considerable difference between them. It is complicated here in the Bay to sex birds because the Chesapeake Bay is a convergence area for other populations. Birds in the southeast come up to the Bay. Birds from the northeast come down to the Bay. And so we get this mix of populations. And there's a size gradient south to north, with the smaller birds being in the south and the largest birds being up in the Maritimes of Canada along the Atlantic coast. And so you get overlap between northern males and southern females. But in general, the females are larger in all categories of morphology. And the one telltale that's always consistent is foot size, and you can see that here. The bird on the right there is a third-year male, and the bird on the left is a fourth-year female. Look at the difference in foot size. The foot size is always a giveaway in the hand. You can virtually always sex these birds if you have the bird in the hand by foot size. The males have real tiny little feet compared to the females. The females have very large, heavy, powerful feet compared to the males. And of course, when you have a pair that's side by side, you can see the striking differences between them. The females have thicker necks. They have barrel chests compared to the male. The females are behaviorally dominant to males. They rule what happens on the nest structure. The male is really assisting the female during breeding. The male is slighter in appearance. And even on the wing, if you look at enough of these birds, you'll see that the male has a shallower depth to the wing. And so it looks like, compared to the body, that it has more of a seabird type wing compared to the female. The female has a thicker wing. And when you look at them flying, the male has a more buoyant flight. The female has a lumbered, heavy flight. And so with some experience, you can tell these apart. When they're side by side, it's much more easy to tell them apart. As you've seen, these birds are large. They require a large nest platform to pull off 3 chicks. This is both adults and a 3-chick brood that are fully grown. You can see there's plenty of space for that 5-bird family. These are large nest structures. They may be 10 feet deep, and they're quite wide at the surface. Most of these nests you can actually lay down and not hang over the edges. So these are large structured nests. They're heavy and they require large specimen trees to support. Something about the diet during breeding, about 94% of the diet during brood rearing is fish here in the Chesapeake. They do feed on other things. This is a box of turtle shells that I collected around the James River here from Eagle Nest, but they're all water turtles. And so eagle's entire life is associated with the water. And so almost all of their prey is somehow associated to the water. They do feed on a lot of turtles, but they're water turtles. And here in the bay, it's mostly stink pots that they feed on. They do feed on mammals, and they do eat some terrestrial mammals. You'll see some squirrel, some possum, some rabbit, but far and away, the most abundant mammal is muskrat. And here's some muskrat skulls collected around the James. Okay, let's say something about the population history. As I think you know, we began to use DDT widely after World War II. What you may not realize is that the bay had a lot of DDT. And in fact, once we reached the late 1960s, some of the highest DDT concentrations in eagle eggs throughout the species range were recorded on the Upper Potomac. So we had a real problem with DDT here in the Chesapeake Bay. We had dramatic declines in a number of our major populations. This was all tipped off by Broly in Florida, his documentation of population decline there. He interacted with National Audubon, and that led to some of the monitoring that we see today. And so in 1955, the National Audubon Society contacted those people around the Chesapeake Bay that were interested in eagles and asked about the possibility of monitoring. Jack Abbott, who was a big VSO person at the time, volunteered to spearhead the bald eagle survey in the Chesapeake Bay. And so Jack, along with the VSO, started a ground survey in 1957, and that extended to 1961. It was really the VSO members that contributed to this, and there were a couple of objectives. One, to document eagle nests, and so a lot of VSO members, Charlie Sterling, people like that, contributed to this, and then to monitor those, to see if there were any chicks being produced. And during this time period, what Jack realized was that there were a lot of places that we just couldn't cover from the ground. They were remote places that were suspected to have eagles. And so Jack was an officer at Fort Belvoir, and he had access to military aircraft. And Jack did the first aerial surveys of the bay in 1962. In fact, they were some of the first aerial surveys for eagles done anywhere on the continent. And they would set an example. And now, as you probably know, aerial surveys are done throughout the continent in virtually every state. And that was started here by Jack. In 1963, Fred Scott joined with Jack. He was already contributing to the survey from the beginning. You know Fred Scott to be the dean of the Virginia Birders, longtime editor of The Raven. Really a critically important figure in the VSO. Fred joined Jack in 1963, and they split up the bay, with Jack flying the surveys from the Potomac North and Fred flying the surveys from the Rappahannock south in the bay down to the James. And so as a team, they surveyed the bay for about 15 years. And much of what we know about the early part of the eagle, lowest point was due to Jack and Fred's work and to the VSO. The VSO was a big supporter and participant in the survey. In 1977, the states took over the survey. Maryland DNR took over the survey in Maryland, and the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries took over the survey in Virginia. Mitchell Byrd was contacted to take over the survey. Mitchell took over the survey in 1977. I joined Mitchell in 1992 with the survey, and the three of us, Mitchell, Byrd, myself, and Captain Fuzzo Shermer, flew together for 30 years during the main part of the population expansion. Mitchell last flew with me in 2020. He was 91. Fuzzo last flew with me when he was 80 years old. So great people, great to spend, probably 4,000 hours in a cramped plane. Can't do that with just anybody. Great people to be in the field we're with. The annual survey really has two components. One is to document the nest. The other is to document productivity. And here you can see a sequence of what the productivity looked like and what the problem was. Maintenance level is the number of chicks needed to offset adult mortality. If you're not meeting maintenance, the population is falling due to attrition. Okay, if you're more than that, then the population is potentially growing, because you have an excess of young being produced. You can see that in the early 1960s and up till about 1980, we were below maintenance, and so the population was in free fall. We have one data point prior to the early 1960s, and that was 1936. That was a survey by Bryant Tyrrell, and that was pre-DDT, and you can see where the productivity was in 1936. So in 1936, from 1936 to the late 1950s, we had a tremendous drop in productivity. Once we reach 1980, we break even in terms of maintenance, and the population then begins to recover dramatically. And this is what the early parts of that recovery looked like. The Fish and Wildlife had set a recovery goal of 150 for Virginia. We reached that in the mid-1990s. And so the population was growing exponentially from the late 70s, actually almost to present, with an incredible doubling time of less than 8 years. Tremendous exponential growth and momentum of the population after it freed itself from the effects of DDT. And I want to show you what that looks like from the low point up to, I guess, 2016. These were nests surveyed by Fred and Jack. Moving over to Mitchell. So you can see this incredible recovery up to 2016. One of the other things I'd like you to notice is a density gradient going from the outer coastal plain toward the tidal fresh. And you can see that the nest spacing on the eastern shore and the western shore is relatively low compared to the tidal fresh. In fact, we published a paper some years ago in the early 2000s that showed that the difference was about 8 to 10 fold. We had an 8 to 10 fold higher density in the tidal fresh compared to the main stem of the bay. If you look at that presently, that difference is about 15 to 20 fold difference. And so birds have continued to pile into the tidal fresh. In fact, the tidal fresh reaches in Virginia of the lower bay are the highest breeding densities ever recorded throughout the range, including Alaska and everywhere else. So these areas are phenomenally productive, and eagles are able to nest at incredible densities there. So this was in 2016. We were at about 680 pairs in the tidal reach of the bay. We're now at about 1,500. The bay's population now is about 3,000. The bay's recovery goal was 300. We reached that in the mid-1990s. We are at about 10 times recovery objective now. So phenomenal recovery, phenomenal population. The Chesapeake Bay now is by far the largest eagle population in the East. Florida was the largest population for a long time. They're at about 1,300. The bay is at about 3,000. So huge recovery. So if we look back and try to get some perspective, what you can see is that the legacy of Silent Spring was a relatively short-lived demographic perturbation to the population that we came out of and recovered. All right, I'd like to say something now about sort of where are we now? What are the things we're concerned about? What are we seeing with the population as we move towards saturation? One of the things that we became acutely concerned about in the mid-1990s was this. This is a scene on the Upper Potomac around the Woodbridge area, that sort of area. We were seeing industrial scale development where we had huge clearing, huge construction. And our concern was that we were effectively giving the eagle habitat to humans. And our concern was that this was a zero-sum game. We can either give the land to humans or we can give it to eagles. They were mutually exclusive. And so the concern was that if we develop too much of this, what does it leave for the eagles? This was in the 1990s. Eagles answered that question. They answered that question by beginning to colonize heavy residential areas. In fact, if you look at today, the fastest growing parts of the population that we currently have are in residential areas. Here's a nest over somebody's pool in Northern Virginia. We have many nests that are over people's houses, dropping fish on their roof or their porch. This is something that was unthinkable in the 1980s and early 1990s. We never thought that eagles would choose to cohabitate with humans, but they have done that, and they have done it successfully. The productivity in these residential areas is very high and sustainable. So it looks like this is going to continue, which is great, because now we realize that habitat is not a zero-sum game. They will occupy areas with us. One of the things that we are consistently concerned about are contaminants within the system. There has been a parade of contaminants within the Chesapeake Bay. That is not going to stop. We always have to be vigilant about contaminants. Periodically, we do take blood samples from nestlings and from adults to monitor contaminants. The legacy contaminants that we were concerned about initially, DDT, dieldrin, PCBs, those have waned within the Chesapeake Bay. They are no longer a major concern for eagles. That is also true for most of the heavy metals. The exception to that, as you probably know, is lead. Lead has emerged as a concern, not just for eagles, but for many large birds, many large predatory birds. And we need to continue to monitor and make progress on lead. Another thing that has emerged, I would say, in the last 5 years is rodenticides. You might remember back in the 1980s, we were concerned about farmland rodenticides. This class of rodenticides is in residential areas. So these are residential rodenticides that are getting into the system and showing up in eagles. Another concern presently is avian flu. We have lost eagles to avian flu. Avian flu doesn't, in this particular round, does not appear like it's going to subside like some of the others. It may be something that's with us for a while, so it's something that we should be aware of. What I'm going to spend the rest of the time discussing is what we refer to as the final chapter of recovery. And I'd like to focus just on the James River. It is amazing that in 1990, we had only 18 pairs on the James River. We have seen an explosion in recovery on the James River since then. In fact, we are probably now approaching 400 pair just on the James. Remember that the recovery goal for the entire Chesapeake Bay was 300 pairs. When Jack Abbott started the survey, he looked at Jamestown Island as what he considered the nexus for eagles, an area that still supported what he considered to be sort of traditional densities. At that time, there were 3 breeding pairs on the James River in the late 1950s. Charlie Hacker, who many of you from the VSO may know, picked up an adult on Jamestown Island in 1963 that was in convulsions under a nest, that bird would die, and it would be determined that it died of DDT toxicity. That particular bird is still in the William Mary collection. What you can see in this particular graph is the period that Fred and Jack monitored. There were only 3 young produced on the James River between 1962 and 1971. Incredibly low productivity. The James River is the only major tributary of the bay that actually went to 0. There were 5 years in the late 1970s where there were no known breeding pairs on the James. The James was recolonized in 1980, and since that time has exploded at just an incredible clip. Going back to Jack Abbott's thoughts about Jamestown Island, that it was a real mecca for eagles with 3 breeding pairs, Jamestown Island today supports 8 breeding pairs. So you can get some sense of how the population has recovered since that time. Yes. And so this is from the James River, and you can see what the maintenance level is there. You can see that we reached maintenance somewhere around 1980 when the population began to recover. Note that we had a heyday in productivity that was from the late 1990s through the early 2000s. Since the early 2000s, we have tracked downward in terms of productivity. In fact, we have retraced down to 1980 levels. And that initially was somewhat perplexing, that we would have a decline in productivity. And I'd like to discuss what we have seen regarding this. And I'm going to focus on 3 periods where I have some other ancillary data. And what you can see here is that there was a significant decline in productivity from the sort of late 90s, early 2000s up to present. And you can see that there are 2 components to that. One is that we have had an increase in nest failure rate over that time. And for those successful pairs, we have had a decline in brood size. So both of those together determine what the productivity levels are, which has declined significantly over this sort of post-recovery period. One other thing that we started seeing was this, asymmetric broods. In all the years early throughout the 1990s while I was flying, we never saw asymmetric broods. When you looked in the nest, the chicks in the nest were very similar in size and development. Now, this started to show up in the late 1990s. Today, this is a very common to see. Sometimes you'll see birds that are feathered out in the nest and other ones are still downy. The chick on the right there is half the weight of the one on the left. The other thing you'll notice, if you can maybe see it close, is that the one on the left has food in the crop. Look at the lower neck of that bird there. It has about a half full crop. The bird on the right there does not have any food in the crop. And so this is an indication of food stress that we're seeing. What happens within these broods is if there's not enough food coming in, let's say it's a 3-chick brood, there will be a dominance hierarchy formed within the brood, and the alpha chick will dominate the food until it's satiated, and then the female will begin to feed the beta. If there's a gamma chick, that chick may not get anything, and if it doesn't get enough, it will die in what we refer to as brood reduction. And so we might lose the 3rd and 2nd chick, leaving only 1 chick. If there's not enough food for that chick, then that's what leads to nest failure. And so this dominance hierarchy that forms is a behavioral mechanism to allow the pair to fit the brood in an optimal way to the amount of food that's coming into the nest, so that the entire brood is not lost. Okay. Now, what this particular image shows is age structure if we have a capped population. I've done a simulation here that shows 100 pairs. So I've capped the population at 100 pairs. And what this shows is the age structure. If the population is capped and productivity continues at a similar rate, then we will converge on a particular age structure. And what you can see for eagles here is that this red area here is what we refer to as floaters. These are birds of reproductive age, so they're 5+. They're adult plumaged birds, but they don't have places to breed. So the population has run out of space, but we have all of these breeding age birds. In eagles, that floater class can be 6 to 8 times higher than the actual territory class. So that means that for every territory holder, we might have 6 floaters in the population. And what this does is to set up class warfare where we have the haves and the have-nots. The have-nots want territories, and they begin to exert downward pressure on the territory holders. They begin to fight for space. I don't know how well you can see that, but here's a sequence that shows some photos of that. You can see the bird coming in. The female is actually on the nest. She's fairly defensive on the nest, defenseless on the nest, and these birds will come in and attack directly the female on the nest. And so one of my previous graduate students showed that these territory holders might be experiencing 6 to 8 attacks per day during the early breeding season. So these are attacks of floaters on territory holders. In order to understand this, you have to understand that there's a division of labor within an eagle pair. The female is dominant to the male, and she typically stays on the nest, providing warmth to the chicks and feeding them until they can feed for themselves. It's the male's responsibility in the first 2 to 3 weeks to do the hunting. So he is responsible for hunting and bringing back food to the nest to feed the brood. His other responsibility is to guard the nest. And so what happens is that now we have so much pressure on the nest from floaters, the male has a difficult trade-off to make. He either goes and hunts to bring back enough food for the brood, or he stays and protects the nest site from intruders. So he is in this torn position about these 2 roles here. Back to these 3 time periods, it turns out that the male was spending about 34% of his time in the late 90s, early 2000s guarding the nest. He was free with all the other time to go hunt and provide for the brood. If you go up to present, the male is now spending 74% of his time guarding the nest from intruders. The consequence of allocating that much time to defense is that he cannot go out and hunt for the brood. And so this is the behavioral feedback due to floaters that is causing the reduction in brood size and productivity. So this is a negative behavioral feedback that ultimately will bring the population into better balance with the available space. And so this is where I think we're headed. I think that we are headed toward much smaller broods in the bay for the bay population to reach some equilibrium with the space. The interesting thing is that in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Chesapeake Bay had the highest reproductive rate recorded throughout the range. We are headed now toward a reproductive rate that is more in line with Alaska. So Alaska did not suffer the deep declines, and so they sustained high breeding densities throughout the DDT era. They weren't exposed. So we have come off of this high and are now down to almost Alaska levels of productivity. And it gives you some perspective about the role of these behavioral mechanisms in the final chapter of recovery. These are the mechanisms that will bring the population into a better balance. So as the pairs produce fewer young, there are fewer young going into the floater pool. That reduces the pressure on the pair. And so productivity may elevate for a bit. And you can see this movement back and forth until we reach some equilibrium state. That's where we are today, is working through this sort of overheated population. So to recap that, bald eagles have exceeded recovery goals. We exceeded recovery goals in the mid-1990s. We're now at about 10 times what the Fish and Wildlife Service recovery goal that was stated for the Chesapeake Bay was, way over. We need to always remain vigilant about pressures on the population, contaminants or other types that may reverse those recoveries. And we have, for the last 20 years, been easing into what we refer to as the final chapter of recovery. You know, that's the population struggling to reach equilibrium with the available space here in the Chesapeake Bay. And so that's where we are with the population. Really appreciate you inviting me to talk about eagles here in the Bay. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much, Bryan. That was fascinating. It explains a lot of the things that I see here in Northern Virginia too. So we do have some questions. Let me bring up the chat here. You mentioned the difference in the size between northern and southern eagles. Do we know why that is?
Yeah, this is one of the ecological laws where we tend to have larger animals in colder climates, and that presumably is related to the surface area that's being exposed to cold. And so most animals that have a large geographic range south to north show this pattern. So it's a gradient in body size related to temperature.
Okay, thank you. And the same person asked, what ritual do they perform during mating? Do they lock talons and cartwheel in the immature stage?
Yeah, so they have fascinating. What you'll see here in the Bay is in late summer, you may not see them paired up as much. Once you get to October, you'll often see the male and female roosting together, and it's typically in a tree that's near. Sometimes it's in the nest tree, sometimes it's one that's near to the nest tree. Once we start to get into, say, December or so, January, you begin to see these ritualized flights where you'll see the pair doing flights together. They might show cartwheel flights, although there's some evidence that a lot of the cartwheel flights that we thought were breeding rituals are actually now intruders and those types of fights. But yes, the cartwheel flight is one type of mating ritual that we'll see. Once we get close to egg laying, and typically lining the nest is a good indication of that, you'll see the pair, they're always together, and that's because the male is guarding from extra pair copulations from other intruders. So he is guarding his female so that she doesn't breed with other males. And so they are together all the time at that point, and you will see them copulate, over a period of a couple of weeks in the area around the nest site in preparation for egg laying.
Okay. Robert mentions a book called The Bald Eagle by Jack E. Davis. And he commented that Audubon was against the bald eagle during the hunting phase of all raptors.
Audubon was, yeah. So there was a lot of controversy about the eagle becoming our national symbol. As you probably know, Ben Franklin favored the wild turkey. saying that the eagle was of ill repute because he fed on carrion and so forth. Yeah, it actually took over a decade to adopt bald eagle as our national symbol. There are a lot of good books, you're right, about bald eagles, Stallmaster being a classic in the 80s.
And we had a question about your maps that showed the nesting density, that there weren't any nests further up in Maryland on the coast side.
Right.
I
Yeah,
assume
there
that's
are
what you
nests.
was
So
just
the
reading.
situation with the survey was that we had parallel surveys until 2004. In 2004, Maryland discontinued their survey. And so that's why those are gone. We did do a joint paper with Maryland combining the entire bay, and it went from the mid 70s up through 2004. Since then, we have done piecemeal surveys in Maryland. We continue to survey some DOD lands and that sort of thing, but there's no comprehensive survey of Maryland. And so they sort of drop out of the picture. But if you look back, we have had parallel tracks in terms of the populations, Maryland and Virginia, and that's why I believe that their population is likely comparable to ours in size.
Okay, thank you. Question about the Atlas data. Were any of the Atlas confirmed nests included in the nest survey data?
Yeah, we've not done a comparison of that, but our aerial monitoring data is available. It's online. You can go to the Eagle Nest Locator and you can view it online. It's been made available to whoever wants it.
So you're using the aerial survey data, not the Atlas.
Yes, that's true.
Okay.
And one other comment about the rest of the state, as almost everybody, all the birding community knows, that we have many pairs that are beyond the fall line now. But when we have done surveys comparing, like for example, the James below the fall line and above, the density of eagles above the fall line drops to about 10% of the densities that we see in the estuary.
Okay.
But we don't know how big the population inland is. That's unknown for us.
Right. If lead is a metal of concern for the eagles, does that mean their fish are contaminated with lead? And does that translate into high concentrations for people who rely on fish? And would lead in fish be easier to monitor than lead in eagles? There's 3 questions.
Yeah, there are some heavy metals that are of concern in fish. As you know, there are mercury advisories throughout Virginia waters in certain areas where mercury is high, and mercury should be considered, when considering consumption. Lead is not one of those. The way that lead gets into eagles is through hunting, the use of lead ammunition mostly. Once we get to the point in mid-fall, when the water temperature in the bay drops, the fish go down into deeper water. They no longer have access to fish. At that point, you begin to see eagles move off of the shoreline. They do feed on waterfowl in the water, but they will begin to hunt carrion off of the shoreline. That coincides fairly closely with the hunting season. And what people don't realize that use lead ammunition is that shooting a deer, you think that the slug passes through without much remnant. It does not. There are a lot of radiographic studies now that show that if there's any bone hit, that slug puts particles of lead throughout the carcass. And there are ways of keeping eagles and other carrion feeders from that, and that's to bury the entrails. If hunters would police their entrails and bury them so they're no longer accessible to these birds, we would have less of a bed problem.
Okay. We have a question about, is, quote, equilibrium, end quote, of the eagle population analogous to carrying capacity?
Yes.
Okay. Same terminology. Okay.
Yes, we oftentimes think of things that constrain populations or regulate populations. Those can be various resources. Oftentimes it's food. The population exploits a food resource. In this particular case, there is plenty of fish in the bay. It's just that the birds are running out of space.
Okay.
So space is the limiting resource here.
I have one person, Glenda Booth, has her hand up. Glenda, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Brian.
Hi.
Forgive me if you've already answered this, but there have been articles recently, like you just said, we're running out of space. And so, can you explain how much space eagles need? Do they have a breeding territory of X, miles? And should we just assume that that's a finite control? In other words, isn't there something we could do about this? I mean, you say the population numbers look great in general, but frankly, I don't know that we could ever have enough bald eagles or other birds. So these sort of arbitrary goals are nice, and of course, it's better than where we were, in the DDT era. But what can we do?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I hope I'm making sense.
Going back to the territory issue, the dogma used to be that, a bald eagle pair required a mile of shoreline, right? That was the dogma historically. We know that's not true now, right? Because we have bald eagle pairs, they'll be incubating and looking eyeball to eyeball. I mean, we have some pairs that are 100 meters, apart now. So the concept of territoriality in birds in general is not a species trait. It's a trait that's related to the food density. So in situations where food is really dense, birds will oftentimes breed closer together, right? So they're defending their necessary space. If there's plenty of food, then they don't mind somebody up against them. But when food is scarce, like for example, if we're talking about eagles out in Colorado, where food is much scarcer for them than here in the tidal fresh, then they have large territories. But in the tidal fresh, they're very compact territories. So the concept is really one of a more flexible territory size. So the question about what's the size of a territory? It really depends on the prey density, right? So it's hard to come up with a hard and fast rule there. So in Alaska, here in the Bay, they're able to nest very close together. In terms of, so there's been an article going around, too many eagles in the Bay. Too many eagles, really, that's a value judgment, isn't it? It really doesn't have anything to do with the population. What's happened, though, is that the population is overheated, meaning that we have more adult birds than we can accommodate with the available space. That's what population biologists refer to as a buffered population, meaning that it's resilient. It can absorb some problems and still maintain the same population size. That's where we are with Chesapeake Bay bald eagles, which is a great place to be. There's a lot of resiliency built into the population currently because of this buffering capacity.
Great, thank you. I have a couple questions about whether eagles are expanding into the Piedmont. Somebody from the Shenandoah Valley says they have breeding pairs in the Shenandoah Valley, for example, 4 pairs in Augusta County. Did they move up the river from the bay, perhaps seeking non-urban options?
Yeah, our assumption is that, so I said that, birds, once they get to mature, they can be floaters, right? So there are actually 2 choices, right? They can be floaters and remain where they are, or they can immigrate out and colonize another area. Both of those things are going on. So the birds that we see in West Virginia, in North Carolina, in the mountains of Virginia, those birds have been overflow from the estuary of the bay. And so, we have always constrained the aerial survey to the to the estuary, and for resource purposes, availability of money to do flights and all. We have not done extensive flights in the Piedmont and mountains of Virginia. We know there are pairs there. People are reporting them to us, and we try to record those. What that population size is, we don't know. We know that the density is probably 1/10 of what it is in the tidal fresh, but the Piedmont and mountains, it's a large area. We used to survey Kerr Reservoir. The Kerr Reservoir has got 20 to 30 pairs alone. So how many pairs are in the inland parts of Virginia? I don't know, 200-300 pair, probably at least.
Okay. The Atlas will help us answer that question.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question about the photo with Mitchell Byrd. Diane says she has to ask if those were paper maps he was holding on to.
Yes, absolutely. And so Mitchell, we have a set of topo maps. These are 7.5-minute topo maps. Those are what Mitchell has always used since the 70s to fly. And so for the James, for example, we have a stack of probably 40 maps. And as we're flying up the drainage, he's going between these maps. And I can tell you, the surveys that we did toward the end of when he was able to fly were not like the surveys in the 70s where you might have 2 pairs. I mean, we were hitting 200 pairs a day, and it's extremely demanding on you to find those nests, to find them on the map. I mean, it is really phenomenal at 91 years of age that Mitchell was able to cognitively handle that survey. I mean, it is extremely demanding. When us younger people fly, we use a GPS enabled tablet, and we can mark them on aerial photographs on a tablet. But Mitchell always preferred the topo maps, and so we have stacks of those.
That's great. How technology changes affects a survey. And then one last question. This is from Patrick, who studies Algonquian Park up in Loudoun County. When surveying our nests on the Potomac Islands, which are legally in Maryland, included in Virginia numbers, or are they part of the lost numbers from Maryland's lack of a current survey?
Yes, we have not surveyed the islands. The center here surveys a number of DoD lands and, say, Park Service lands and all, like Indian Head, for example, over in Maryland, we survey and so forth, but not a comprehensive survey. We have never included the Maryland islands of the Potomac in the Virginia survey.
Okay, and this would be above the falls also, so.
Oh, yes, and we have not surveyed above the falls. And after, the 9/11 issues with the airspace around DC, it's extremely difficult to fly in that airspace now.
Right, so, okay. Those are the questions that I have in the chat, and I don't know if any other hands are up, so.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Bill, you want
Yes, thanks, Brian. Extraordinary presentation, of course. I think the questions reflect the not only the knowledge, but the concerns that people have. And I think you've answered a lot, given people a lot to think about, as well as giving them a lot of understanding of the hope for the population being sustained. I'd also like to thank everybody who spent the evening with us, and we'd appreciate your feedback on how we could improve this kind of meeting. Remember that in 2029, we're going to be hitting our 100th anniversary, and it would be neat for the organization to be able to get together as we used to be able to. So that's a goal for all of us to try to look forward to that, to be able to join rather than having a Zoom meeting like this. But thanks everybody for being here. Thanks Dixie for making all this happen and coordinating everything. So unless anybody else has got any comments, I think the meeting is officially adjourned. Phil.
Phil's recording the time, right?
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks, everybody. Brian, that was fabulous.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. I love the science.
See you all.
Bye.
Thank you. I'm gonna end the meeting now.